The National Council of Provinces has given the green light to the 3 gender-based violence bills. These include the Domestic Violence Amendment Bill. Women and children are brutally murdered every day, and some families never see justice. The question now is, will these bills help ramp up the fight against gender-based violence, or is it another blunt instrument? Let's speak to gender activist Lisa Vetten now. Lisa, thank you so much for making time. So we're talking here about the Criminal Law Amendment Act. We're talking about the Criminal and Related Matters Amendment Act. There's the Domestic Violence Act. What difference are these bills going to make in the fight against gender-based violence?
Well, I would say that one of those bills is largely irrelevant, and that is the amendments to the National Sex Offenders Register contained in the Sexual Offences Act. That is not really a particularly useful amendment or a particularly useful piece of legislation at the best of times. What that tries to do is place more people on the register, but I think forgets the fundamental problem, which is this, that in order to go onto that register, you need to be convicted. So by focusing our attention on the 6 to 7% who get arrested, we are leaving untouched all the problems that allow the 93% to never stand trial. And it would have been much better to put energy into looking at where the leakages and failures are in the policing system, the health system, and the courts, than to fiddle with the end point, right at the end of the criminal process. So I don't regard that as a very meaningful intervention. The amendment to the Domestic Violence Act, on the other hand, as well as the Criminal Procedure Act, do have potential to make a difference. Once again, it will be the classic problem that always confronts government. Can they implement what they have put in place? But if you'd like me to give you a bit of a summary of those 2 bills.
Yes, please.
Okay. So the one, I think, what I think is very useful about that bill is the way it takes away the right of the police to give bail to men who've been reported, or anybody who's been reported for that matter, of a case of domestic violence. So the typical problem has been women go and lay charges. They might arrest the partner. They give him police bail, and so he's home within hours to, simply to continue with his violence, and perhaps become even worse because now he's really angry that he's been arrested. So that piece of legislation removes that prerogative from the police, and there has to now be a standard bail process. And it also looks at how to strengthen the intermediary system and other protections in court, which would all be important. So that's just a very brief summary. Yeah. The amendments to the Domestic Violence Act expand the definition of what is domestic violence, and I think they do a couple of other really interesting things. Firstly, they allow for complainants to make applications online, so they don't necessarily have to go and stand at a court all day only to be told it's too late, they must go home. That will be very positive. What's also really important is that they place a new range of duties on a whole range of sectors who didn't previously have a role, like the health sector. And that's important because far too many women go to casualty every couple of months in order to be treated to their injuries and sent straight home without the doctor ever asking, who hit you? Recording their injuries and saying, here's a referral to a shelter. So I think if we can make these options work well, and we train and equip the health sector to work well, that could be a meaningful point of intervention, because I would think that from our experience, more women go to hospital and to healthcare practitioners than necessarily lay charges or go to the court. So they're an extremely key point of intervention who've been ignored for too long.
Yeah. Now that the bills have been passed, what's the next step? Because obviously this is not going to be our silver bullet, right? The idea that the law solves all our gender-based violence problem in South Africa is flawed. Absolutely.
I mean, what's going to be really, really important is to ensure, firstly, that some of the new measures that they've introduced are costed. Because too often these things get rushed through and there's no thinking of, well, what's the training that will need to be done? There are these new duties on healthcare workers, duties on clerks. Do we have the money to train them in order to ensure that they can do this properly? Do we even have enough people to be able to enforce these new obligations? So you've got to have the costing and an implementation plan. Government is really bad at that. And the Domestic Violence Act is a case in point. It's never really been properly costed. So there would need to be that. There would need to be the training. There would also need to be the directives to support the legislation, the actual day-to-day guidance of how you do these things.
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes the laws are good on paper, and if you don't have people supporting and ensuring implementation, even us as society, making sure that we reflect and change our behaviors as men, then nothing is really going to change. Do you feel that the justice system, Lisa, is somehow going to serve as a deterrent as soon as these bills are now into law and are effected?
You know, law can be a deterrent to some men. To others, they're not a deterrent at all. And those are often men who perhaps have friends in the police, have a routine history of violence towards others. Prison doesn't really bother them that much. I think for some men who are, what better putting it, more respectable, it can make a difference. But the important thing will be, are the police going to be properly trained? Are the courts going to be properly trained? And we have a serious problem with the police. I think there's been coverage of how their disciplinary system has broken down. How, for instance, they prosecute or discipline only a minority of those who kill people. So, you know, domestic violence, if you can report that as misconduct to the police as well, but if they're not even taking disciplinary action against officers who are accused of killing people, then I don't know what's going to happen, what they're doing with domestic violence. So there has to be key intervention into the day-to-day policing, the nitty-gritty stuff, which we don't pay attention to. Like, are there victim empowerment officers at police stations? Do the victim-friendly systems work? And at this point in time, the answer is not really.